open right there. They understand the flood the zone strategy. They're trying to fight back. A lot of this taking place in federal court. Of course, all of your embeds in the federal government are fighting back and leaking. Folks should understand this is the White House has got pedal down and no brake. Things are coming out. Everything President Trump gave a great brief to the press on his populist tax cuts. We'll get to that. Natalie, give us a sense of the White House. How's it going? And particularly on the resistance, ma'am, to flood the zone.
Yes, well, I'm always honored to sit in that press briefing room and have a front row seat, not just to the press briefings, but more importantly to the resistance, which, of course, is, I think, the bedrock of it becoming more and more each day. The mainstream media, before we get into all the lawsuits, or I guess we should say the lawfare, I just want to give, I guess it's a little bit of an exclusive, put our audience inside the room as I was getting ready to come out here and do this hit. I have to say it was really, I mean, from my perspective, a glorious feeling going on in that press briefing room, but every single mainstream media journalist looked so dejected. I was listening to their conversations. They're all so tired. They're like, I don't even know how to cover this. I think the quote of the day has to be, it's just all dismantling. It's dismantling everything. And I wanted to turn to him and say, well, yes, exactly. And that's what the American people elected President Trump to do. But in terms of pushing back against this dismantling, getting into the serious stuff, I think last night was really the most intense I've ever seen MSNBC really engage with the resistance, even saying that word, which sort of wasn't really spoken out loud all that often, saying it explicitly. And that's because today on various verticals, you've seen the lawfare that they've been planning and pooling for a while sort of come to fruition. Obviously, we hit the Department of Labor lawsuit earlier today, keeping DOJ kind of preemptively out of their hair. Obviously, Treasury, with the exception of two individuals having read-only access to what's going on up in Treasury with Scott Bessent. That was what we covered this morning. But since then, about an hour before we came to air, the infamous buyout offer, right, the fork in the road email, a district judge here in D.C., a Clinton appointee, stepped in and essentially said that we won't be able to roll that out. They're going to have an additional hearing on Monday.
Has put a temporary stop on President Trump and Elon Musk's attempt to buy out the federal workforce, ruling that both the administration and the labor unions who brought the suit need more time to brief their arguments, meaning that until the next hearing, which is, by the way, scheduled for Monday, all employees who may have taken the buyout must be told the offer is blocked until at least next week. There are some major questions, though, about what's going to happen after that. First and foremost, whether the offer is legal, but also, even if it is, whether the government has the money to fund the buyouts. After all, Congress has not allocated any money for that purpose, and there is still a looming fight over a shutdown.
One of the members of the engine room just, said, hey, look, it's kind of blitzkrieg. It's to overwhelm, envelop, and continue to move on, not stop. Bang, bang, bang. Natalie, and these people are smart, and they're particularly using what they've got, which is media, which they've been a little bit overwhelmed, but also to use the courts now, and to use your brilliant term, the embeds that infest this government. Of the 2.5 million civilian, I think we got 40,000. Was it 40,000 takes on the buyout? Was that the number?
I think it was about 2% of the entire workforce. I think we need to add at least another 0 to that. I guess maybe, hey, the silver lining of postponing this till Monday is that I guess more people can sign on. But to go back to this concept of embed, Steve, because I think that really gets to the heart of it, right? The concept of civil society, but most importantly, civil service and civil servants at that, right? That was sort of the cornerstone of their resistance, since they lack any institutional power right now. And the group that actually sued to stop this fork in the road email memo was actually Democracy Forward, the group that we've been talking about extensively, the consortium of over 200 resistance-type groups. You got the ACLUs, the SPLCs, every, woke group that exists under the sun and probably is receiving your taxpayer dollars. But they all represent and basically create this group called Democracy Forward. But remember, the first step that they took when they set up this new group was to create something called Civil Service Strong. And it was a very activist approach. I always described it as sort of the impeachment that could have been, right? They were instructing federal servants to basically become whistleblowers, how they could best do that, how they could best file lawsuits themselves, citing discrimination. And I think, frankly, Steve, the best and most interesting, frankly, insightful part of the whole Democracy Forward operation is that one of their board members was actually a DOJ career civil servant under both Biden and President Trump in the voting rights division. And I think that that speaks to the concept of embed with rather metaphorical significance, that the same guy who wants to now make the case that all of these civil servants are not doing anything to oppose President Trump's legislative agenda, well, that's now the very same guy who's on the board of the organization suing President Trump for trying to rid his administration of people just like him. But I will say a bright spot today. Obviously, there was a lot of outrage. I was going to say media outrage, but I think not from the outlets that are just a few feet away from me because they're all on the take from USAID. But President Trump ordered GSA to rescind any federal funding, subscriptions or otherwise, going to outlets including, but not limited to, because they're investigating it, Politico, the BBC, and the New York Times. So maybe that's why there are the long faces in that press briefing room.
Talk about the morale at the White House. I mean, these folks are working now 7 days a week, 18-hour days. I understand the euphoria when you first get there, the intensity, but they're under onslaught. They're getting the bad looks from the media, and as you know, the White House briefing room, which is still right there, it's not moved over to EOB, is right in the middle of things. What's the energy you're seeing from EOB and from the West Wing? What's the energy, the intensity? How are we doing?
Well, frankly, I think DOJ needs to get to work in the press briefing room, but I'll leave that aside for a second. Look, I think that what it has come down to, obviously, they have embeds. They've done the burrowing in of all the the presidential appointments under President Biden, turning them into career civil servants. They've tried to mount the best resistance that they can. But unfortunately, and we are not, shall we say, sunshine soldiers. We are winter soldiers here in the war room. We call shots. We call balls and strikes. Every person, for the most part, there's always some issues, but who has been appointed under President Trump, I think particularly at the Department of Justice, has been an absolute killer. And I think that there's, if you really get down to it, a certain level of agency and autonomy that a lot of these individuals have in terms of feeling comfortable to actually push back and carry out their own mandate, that I think if you really get to the core of it, much like the resistance is very systemic, well thought out, and well planned. I know you aren't allowed to say the words Project 2025, but this is a resistance, a sort of pro-Trump resistance that's been being planned for a very, very long time, right? We had 4 years to plan this, and I think what you're seeing is execution. And I know the comm shop has been working overtime to really message and push back against a lot of the smears coming from the mainstream media. I think one point, an example that really showcases this is that the mainstream media is trying to take a bunch of laps and dunk, not just on the White House, but on the sort of, X brigade, saying that, oh, well, some of the grants that you guys have identified, they're actually not coming from USAID, but rather they're coming from the State Department. And I think that logic, Steve, actually proves why President Trump's federal funding freeze needs to be implemented. Because it's not just USAID. There is something rotten within the entirety of this government. And I think President Trump and, like I said, the Twitter researchers, the Twitter investigators, the DOJ people are really getting to the bottom of it. And it really is firing on all cylinders. And like I said, Steve, the real tell, I wish the audience, I would do anything I could to bring you guys inside that room with me. They're an absolute meltdown. I believe I heard everyone say, I can't believe it's not Friday yet. I can't believe the week's not over. It feels like we've been here for months. It feels like this is the longest week ever. It's just about dismantling. How do we cover it? And then another quote, I don't think that, the people want to read about all these stories about these random agencies being shut down. And I was like, no, we do, and we're going to.
Well, this is what deconstruction administrative state is. right? They're seeing it right now. That
They're
is a
copying
dismantling.
you, yeah.
I think going through. Yeah, no, but I think going through and looking at the numbers and what Elon's doing in that regard is very powerful. And obviously with USAID and others, I'll talk in a little while about. I think we got to start getting serious about where we're going to have the big cuts, because the 14th of March is not going to go away, and that's when the government runs out of money. Last thing before I let you go, Ezra Klein, this thing is going super viral on the left with the Indivisible group, Democracy Forward, the media. They feel Ezra Klein's giving them a way forward, particularly that Trump really doesn't have any power. He has the projection of power. And if they just pick, if they don't go after everything, as we keep saying here, focus is power, focus is power. They're trying to say the same mantra, to pick and choose where you fight Trump. Do you believe that, as you see it, the left is picking that up right now?
Kind of sounds like the foil to Curtis Yarvin. You know, I don't necessarily, I can't put myself in the mindset or the shoes of the resistance types, but as someone who has read, I think, every pamphlet available in terms of what they're telling their audience, I attend all their town halls, I watch all of the rhetoric that they're putting out there. I think truly, Steve, part of it is cope, right? They need the idea that what they can do actually has some effect. And I think up until yesterday, their efforts to push back through the media were really not all that successful. I think today they've started to see some legal and lawfare victories, albeit temporary, right? They're not the permanent injunctions that they're pushing for, so we'll see how that works out when President Trump's team actually has the opportunity to push back. But this mindset of civil society, I think the biggest lie, frankly, Steve, being pushed on sort of the grassroots left right now is that they actually have a voice in the resistance movement, because this is something that's not happening, right? That's sort of the, I think, juxtaposition of our show versus the left-wing grassroots, right? Our resistance is driven by the people who view this show, and it's against the party elites. Democrat resistance is driven by the party elites, oftentimes against their own grassroots. But the grassroots, what they want to see come from the party, the more populist left-wing stuff, they're never going to get. So they're sort of fighting for a Pyrrhic victory, right? They're only fighting to make Democratic power brokers and elites kind of have that institutional power. It's the people like Norm Eisen, it's the Victoria Newlands, it's the regime change people who are really focused on this. And frankly, Steve, I don't even think the paradigm, much like you always say, is necessarily Democrat-Republican. You're talking about USAID, you're talking about an existential threat, not just to Democrats, but to this sort of just neocon, for lack of a better world order that, in the same way, it's the Soros groups too, but it's also the International Republican Institute that thinks that we need to be the world's policeman. So it's an interesting thing that we're definitely going to be tracking here, but I think the audience just needs to remember groups like Indivisible, Democracy Forward, Democracy 2025, and of course Democracy Docket, Mark Elias's group. These are what we need to be focusing on. Don't get lost with the shiny toys. That's the hotbed of resistance.
Natalie, very proud of the work you're doing. The one person is kind of trying to coordinate all this and see it. It's just amazing. So where do people go for your social media, man?
Thank you. Natalie G. Winters on all social media platforms. Thank you for having me. And thank you to the audience for letting me stand inside that really depressed briefing room.